So we've seen Western educated, as you said, industrialized. We understand the democratic. I mean, but what got me though was the ex-Christian part. That one I wasn't anticipating to see within this book, because at that time I would think, I mean, you've proven the otherwise, but I would think that there was a lot of Christians that were there at that time. And it was a huge movement of faith across the board. And it was. I mean, we know about the Wesleys and the Whitfields and that kind of thing. But what made you go, hey, ex-Christian? This actually, it's been set up to be ex-Christian all the way back in the 1700s to now. I mean, what really brought that to the surface?
That's interesting. That might be the idea that has got the deepest roots for me. I haven't been asked that before. I think that it came originally from reading a book by Alistair McGrath about 20 years ago called The Twilight of Atheism, in which had nothing to do with my research. I wasn't researching this, but I haven't even thought about this book for a long time after that. But he wrote basically a book saying that the late 18th century and the French Revolution in particular marked the high noon of modern atheism, and what we're now seeing is the twilight. And I think you could engage with that and push back in various ways, but it was a fascinating case from obviously a brilliant intellectual historian and theologian who made the case, effectively introduced me to, I'd not really read much of the French, particularly in France, the French atheists and at the time, and the people who were both the sort of anti-Christian brigades, like Voltaire, who's not an atheist at all. Voltaire thinks we should believe it. He famously said, if God didn't exist, we'd have to invent him. So he's not an atheist at all, but he really hates the Catholic Church. And is trying to destroy it. And then you have proper, more like what we would call thoroughgoing atheists. We have people like Sard, as you mentioned, people like Diderot, Baron d'Holbach, and then people who don't quite say I'm an atheist, but they're making very anti-critical of Christianity arguments. People like David Hume, and actually in their own ways, Tom Paine and Jefferson and others. And they're all around at this point. And this is probably the most intellectually stimulating. If you wanted to be an atheist at any period in history, or wanted to be somebody who was opposing Christianity and say, when did it feel like we were sweeping all before us? You'd probably pick maybe 1770s or probably even more 1780s or early 1790s, before the terror kicked in and everything unspooled in France. And so that's probably maybe the idea I had earliest. I think if you'd asked me 10 years ago before working on this, where do you think the world's move towards a post-Christian way of thinking took its biggest steps forward, I'd probably say towards the later period of the European Enlightenment in around the 1770s and 80s. And I still think that. Now, obviously, I then tell the story by trying to bring in the French side, which is very significant. In some ways, the three most important figures there are the ones I mentioned, Sard, Voltaire, and Diderot, in different ways. But I also tell the American story through that edit to the Declaration, and not just that edit. That edit's more a parable, really, than a kind of argument for why it happened. But you do have a very significant development in America, even that it sits in between the first and second Great Awakenings, but you also have quite a strong, not that Christian impetus to a whole bunch of things in American life as well. And then I'll even get on to Tocqueville towards the end. So this is just a fascinating, Tocqueville has really surprised me. It's like these people are very Christian and very, what I would call pagan. They've got a very pagan flavor to the things that they pursue. So, and he's trying to make sense of it. He can't quite work out how America is so Christian and yet so obsessed with this worldly material prosperity at the same time, which of course is something that as a non-American is still very striking about America now. The religiosity mingled with the sort of very material, looking for present prosperity and experience and the pursuit of happiness. And that, I think, for many people in the world, is like America is very unusual in that way. And so I think there is a bit of that on your side of the Atlantic as well, but more of it is driven by what's happening intellectually in Europe and particularly in France.
And you called it Protestant paganism? Isn't that the terminology that you use? And I went, oh, that'll preach.
Well, who knows? I like that because that's really me trying to do an intellectual genealogy of modern post-Christianity to try and synthesize there's a Catholic account which I think has got a lot of truth to it, but is certainly very overstated in some settings, which is that really the reason you have modern secularism is because of Protestantism and the divisions in Christendom it brought about. But then there's another telling of the story, which is actually there's a low-level paganism that to some degree has always been here that rose up again in the Enlightenment. And I think both of those stories have a lot of merit, but I think it's actually the synthesis of the two, the sort of almost like a reaction between two elements that come together and then are catalyzed by industrialization and enrichment in particular, that caused this to the way that. But of course, that idea, that Protestant paganism, doesn't trickle down into the experience of many in the West until midway through the 20th century for many. That's where post-Christianity begins. And in your country, really, a lot of that is really kicking in the last 10 years or so. Like, it's fascinating that what's happened it's taken 80 years in Europe, it's taken 8 years in America. But even in the 90s, you would look at America and say, wow, this is incredibly religious compared to all other countries that are as wealthy as North America, which had lots of people writing books as to why. But I think in the end, that those two forces, Protestantism and paganism, have collided and generated what we see. But it just is the ripples take a long time to permeate through the whole of society.